So, I know I'm late to the internet's Let's Kick Game of Thrones Season 8 while it's down block party fiesta extravaganza, but I really do need to talk about the much rightfully maligned fast travel that's in the show, which is a criticism that, to my knowledge, has been brought up in a serious or even in a semi-serious tone. It goes without saying, there will be spoilers for Game of Thrones, all of it in this video. Game of Thrones Season 8 shit the bed worse than Robert Baratheon drifted into a drunken stupor amid octagonal cornucopic coitus. While HBO's mature fantasy series was once the golden age of television's crown jewel due to it being a critical and commercial darling, casual viewers, fans, and fans read trolls hated the final season as much as the dude Lebowski's less than stellar opinion of the fucking Eagles, man.
Man, come on, I had a rough night and I hate the fucking Eagles, man.
Angry viewers flocked to message boards and left vicious comments. Exasperated YouTubers recorded numerous video rants in order to express their frustration. Some fans, hopefully out of catharsis, even went on to sign an impractical and mean-spirited Change.org petition urging HBO to call a creative mulligan on the penultimate season and redo the entire 6 episodes in order to deliver a satisfying conclusion to the show. The reasons for Game of Thrones' descent from grace are varied, yet the show's woes can mostly be blamed squarely on the lackadaisical bad show-running efforts from producers David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, who are fleeing the scene of the crime of this massacred IP at light speed towards more bountiful opportunities at Disney's new rendition of Skywalker Ranch, where they can now milk the sweet blue nectar of the Star Wars cash cow, mugging the camera like an even less aware dark side Phil. Benioff's and Weiss's scriptwriting for Season 8, and let's be honest, Season 7 and some aspects of, other seasons as well, left much to be desired. Even though the show had interesting endpoints where the characters ended up at, the final season didn't offer much in the way of good narrative reasoning for the characters being to where they were at the said endpoints, in a way that makes logical sense in terms of character motivations, and in a series that's renowned for its realistic take on fantasy, that's a really fatal flaw. This is why people make fun of the Bells causing Daenerys to lose her shit for basically no reason, why Jaime decided to leave Brienne to be with his shit sister, how Jon Snow was an idiot, and how Euron Greyjoy launched the Spear of Destiny twice into Rhaegon with pinpoint accuracy, murdering both the show's second favorite and second least favorite dragon in the process, only for those same dragon-slaying weapons to be useless one episode later due to narrative convenience. They must have been nerfed in the Day 1 patch. However, Game of Thrones Season 8 and Season 7 as well as most obvious representation of scriptwriting ineptitude was in the show's much lampooned fast travel indulgences. And how couldn't it be? Early episodes emphasized the show's realism by how the characters traverse the world. In early seasons, a character journeying from the northern stronghold of Winterfell to the Westerosi capital King's Landing, which is south, would take a minimum of 2 episodes, if and only if the travels went without a hitch. Relatively speaking, of course. Contrast that level of detail in the earlier seasons to the cognitive minimalism represented in Season 8 and Season 7, where a whole army moves that same distance, a frozen tundra to a dry, sandy desert within a few scenes max. It's really jarring. In terms of the show, this is clearly the fault of the writers just not giving a fuck anymore for reasons. And we all know those reasons. Pew pew! But what many show watchers don't know is that series traversal is a problem in the books as well, albeit in a different way. And to understand why the show fucked this up so bad, we need to talk more about the books. So before we dive into Martin's writings and criticize aspects of his writing style, let me be upfront about something. I think George R.R. Martin is an incredibly talented writer and has written numerous great stories, and the slow pace of which he's writing the final books of A Song of Ice and Fire don't accurately reflect his ability to write and the scope of his imagination. However, everyone knows that George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire novels, the series Game of Thrones is based on FYI, everyone knows that those books aren't done. In fact, the previous book was released over 8 years ago, and the show surpassed that book by the end of Season 5, with the 6th title, The Winds of Winter, being finished in the future. Sometime. Maybe. Possibly. Hopefully. The Song of Ice and Fire series has been a staple of the fantasy genre since the mid-90s, with the first 3 and honestly best books, A Game of Thrones, A Clash of Kings, and A Storm of Swords, releasing in 1996, 1998, and 2000 respectively. After that, the series didn't return until 2005, I think, in A Feast for Crows. However, that book deserves to be labeled with an asterisk, seeing as it only contained half a continuation of the story because it had around half of the POV characters like Cersei and Jaime Lannister, Arya and Sansa, whereas 2011's Book 5, A Dance with Dragons, took place at the same time and featured the other half of that story, as well as the other half of the Game of Thrones roster like Tyrion, Jon Snow, Daenerys, Ramsay, Theon, Stannis, Bran, and my Calculus 2 instructor. This is a clear indication that something went wrong in the creative department. Think about it. The amount of perspectives, POV characters, and supporting characters became so bloated that they couldn't be contained in a single 1,000-page book. In fact, this concurrent plot in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons took 11 years of writing and 2 books with nearly 2,000 pages combined. And here's the kicker, those 2 books are the weakest of the A Song of Ice and Fire series. Like, A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons are very plotting. The first 3 books are much tighter in terms of narrative and are just much better books in general. Like, they're much more enjoyable. Compared to Game of Thrones, Clash of Kings, and my favorite of the series, A Storm of Swords, which is pretty much seasons 3 and 4, which are the best seasons of the Game of Thrones show, FYI. One of those books do more than the plotting Feast of Crows and a solid More Happens Yet Still plotting Dance with Dragons combined. Oops! And keep in mind, this happened before Game of Thrones aired. The reason for the later novels' pacing problems can be attributed to the author's self-described writing style, and that he is a gardener.
I have always said that I believe there are 2 types of writers, which I call the architect and the gardener. The gardener, he may know the general shape of the garden that he wants, but still, he's digging a hole in the ground, he's planting a seed. And, you know, he has some idea what's going to come up, the gardener. The gardener knows whether he's planted an oak tree or whether he's planted a radish. So it's not totally random. There's a lot that goes to chance with and to other elements with the gardener. The garden is a living thing.
But the problem with the gardening style is that if you don't maintain the garden, then the branches get everywhere and the whole aesthetic becomes a tangled mess. I.e., you plant a seed, whether it's a character or narrative plot line, and just let it go from there and just go where the story takes you as a writer. One of these entangled messes for George R.R. Martin can be described as the Maronese Knot. In the books, and as well as the show, the Maronese Knot is essentially a bunch of plot lines and characters all converging onto one location, but the knot was how hard it was for Martin to get these characters and these narrative aesthetics to coincide at the same time. To quote, the Maronese Knot was a confluence of many factors. Let's start with the offer from Zorro to give Dany ships, the refusal of which then leads to Karth's declaration of war. Then there's the marriage of Daenerys to pacify the city. Then there's the arrival of the Yunkish army at the gates of Meereen. There's the order of arrival of various people going her way. Tyrion, Quentyn, Victarion, Aegon, Marwyn, etc. And then there's Daario, this dangerous sellsword, and the question of whether Dany really wants him or not. There's the plague. There's Drogon's return to Meereen. All of these were balls I had thrown up into the air, and they're all linked and chronologically intertwined. The return of Drogon to the city was something I explored as happening at different times. For example, I wrote 3 different versions of Quentyn's arrival at Meereen. One where he arrived long before Dany's marriage, one where he arrived much later, and one where he arrived just the day before the marriage, which is how it ended up being in the novel. And I had to write all of 3 versions to be able to compare and see how these different arrival points affected the stories of the other characters, including the story of a character who actually hasn't even arrived yet. End quote. In other words, Martin had a shit ton of characters and a shit ton of plot lines, and really had to find a way to make them coalesce together in a way that is interesting. They all had to arrive at a particular place in a particular time of the plot, while also having good narrative reason as to why they're arriving at that particular place and time. Even worse is that many of these characters are already existing ones who need to do something interesting character-wise whilst waiting for their plots to kick in. While there was also new characters that had to be introduced and were equally necessary to the story. Seriously, the Maronese Knot was basically a self-made noose, and is why books 4 and 5 are just so bloated and plotting and just aren't as enjoyable to read as the first 3 books. If only some characters had discovered a way to magically teleport themselves to where they needed to be so that it just wouldn't take so long to get to the good stuff. Wow, teleportation. What a radical concept for a fantasy novel. Many other fantasy series were able to circumvent this style of mere knees not. First and foremost, let's talk about another famous fantasy series lacking in teleportation, by which I mean the 20th century's fantasy crown jewel, and most beloved series despite its terrible prose, which is JRR Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. In comparison to Game of Thrones, the Lord of the Rings trilogy is a lot shorter, and it's much more focused and tight in terms of plot, with minimal point of view characters. However, what Lord of the Rings really does have in common with Game of Thrones is that it is very dark in tone. Even though it lacks the explicit sex in the mature sense that Game of Thrones does, because that's what mature means, Rings thematically delves into the very nature of life and death and how life decays over time. A lot of people like to focus on the sillier aspects of Lord of the Rings, like the smiling, silly hobbits. But the Lord of the Rings often doesn't get the credit it deserves for being a dark story. Like, the books and the movies based on them are about death and decay. And that's a pretty tough subject matter. That's dark. I don't care if there's, like, hugging hobbits on a bed. Like, this is a dark story. The Lord of the Rings also has a similar magic system to Game of Thrones, in that it's a soft magic system. Most of the main characters don't really have magic abilities, and if they do have magical powers, then there isn't really a system in place that explains why the magic works the way it does. For example, we don't learn the science behind the One Ring as to why it's powerful. It's just magic. It does what it does. The magic in the series is both beyond the average mortal and the readers' and viewers' comprehension. For example, you might wonder, why doesn't the wizard Gandalf throw fireballs while he's in Moria? And to answer, who knows? It's above our pay grade. The magic system in Lord of the Rings fits with the idea of divine intervention, kind of like the Eagles.
And I hate the fucking Eagles, man.
You know, the Eagles act the same way as magic does in this series, and even though people have spent years agonizing over the supposed plot hole regarding how the Fellowship of the Ring could have just used Eagles in order to bum rush Mordor via an air attack and airdrop the one payload to rule them all into Mount Doom, it is really beside the point, because thematically the Eagles, as well as the magic system, are just beyond us. It's a sign of a higher power. Yes, technically Gandalf using limited magic in Moria, as well as the Eagles not helping out until the very end, could be described as a plot hole, but thematically it fits with the whole divine intervention aesthetic of the series. Similarly, Game of Thrones also has a soft magic system, but this is less to do with divine intervention and more to do with the realistic tone that it carries.
Pig shit.
Another reason for the lack of a fast travel component in The Lord of the Rings is that the journey takes place one way. The quest sees our valiant heroes traveling, for the most part, southwest towards Mordor. The Fellowship's travels mostly take them to new location, and when it comes to writing, experiencing new locales offers its own kind of drama, seeing as there is always something new to see. The movie adaptations for The Lord of the Rings did a terrific job capturing that sense of awe whenever a new location is introduced both to the hobbits and the audience. Game of Thrones operates kind of similarly to this, at least in the earlier novels, where a lot of the drama itself was the fact of traveling from location to location, as characters as well as the audience discovered new, interesting locales in the world of Westeros. However, in Game of Thrones, this gets old eventually because all of the characters, because there's so many of them, we've already seen most of the locations. Like that by the time we go to the Eyrie again, we've already been to the Eyrie, so that sense of awe is gone. If Lord of the Rings was a longer series with multiple POV characters traveling to and from locations we've seen over and over again, well, the characters in the audience wouldn't look at the location like we were gobsmacked every time. Usually when fantasy books become longer, they either introduce new plot elements to make the traversal to the destination more interesting, or they'll create quicker ways to expedite the travel so that we don't have to go through a Feast for Crows, Dance with Dragons, Mere Knees Knots kind of slog. In other words, if characters are moving back and forth to the same location over and over again, there has to be some sort of narrative reason to keep the audience interested, because obviously the location isn't new anymore. It's old hat by now and needs something else in the narrative to prop it up in order to give the audience invested in the story.
Pig shit.
A small-time, little, unpopular fantasy series named Harry Potter is a great example of this in terms of how it uses the Hogwarts Express. In the first year, we see Harry Potter and crew go to the Hogwarts Express via platform 9 3/4, which is just magical. You just watch kids get on a train and go to Howard's School of Wizardcraft and Witchery. It's just cool, magical, and full of delightful whimsy. But by the time the sequel comes around and they have to redo the whole Platform 9 3/4 shenanigans and go on the whimsy train, I don't care. And J.K. Rowling, as flawed as a writer she is, clearly understands this. That's why in Dirty Harry Potter 2, The Secret Chambers, Harry and Ron couldn't get to the train. There was a wall of plot literally preventing them. So they take a flying car to make this passage more interesting and also connect it to the narrative more. Don't drink and drive a flying car, kids. In year 3, Harry Slaughter 3, Franz Kafka Band, they use the Hogwarts Express travel to introduce the Dementors. In Harry Potter 4, The Gobshite of Fire, the Hogwarts Express ride was very minimal in the books, not too much going on there. In number 5, they introduced the Threstrals, which is important to the themes and narrative. In 6, Harry tries to be Wizard Jason Bourne and spy on Malfoy, and that's kind of what's going on. And in 7, the kids skip school to fight Wizard Hitler, so there was no whimsical train ride. Man, just imagine other 7th year kids going on the Hogwarts Express. One time is good. One time on the whimsy train is enough, that's like a whole day's worth of travel. Who would make their kids do that, especially if there's other ways to travel? Sure, the wizard train's fun, but the whole wizard Nazis kind of take away from that whole magical experience, maybe, Over the course of the 7 novels, the books begin introducing other fast travel style elements like apparating, which is basically viewed like a driver's license is, and is essentially wizard teleporting. Then there's fireplace travel via flue powder, and then there's port keys, and you teleport to a specific location. Unless you're Muggle-born, you probably don't need to take the train every year, this is just a waste of time, despite all the whimsy. However, if you want a fantasy novel series that is more comparable to Game of Thrones and trying to figure out what the fast travel is like in other books, let's talk about The Wheel of Time. So let me be upfront, when it comes to finished fantasy series, The Wheel of Time is my favorite book series ever. In Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time, the series starts with a Tolkien-esque inspired tale of country bumpkins traveling northeast to the place of evil. Oh, side note, seeing as Robert Jordan was a southerner, I wonder what the real-life inspiration for the northeast evil place was. That or he really hated Canada. Sure, there's some variations with The Wheel of Time that makes it different from, say, Lord of the Rings, i.e. the main characters are from a much less paradisical locale than the Shire, but the similarities are by design and in order to contrast with the more modern and character-based storytelling and themes in the book. So, in the first Wheel of Time novel, The Eye of the World, the characters travel to the bad place, and the sense of discovery is similar to how it is in Lord of the Rings and the earlier Game of Thrones novels. But here's the thing, the main characters go to a bunch of places that they haven't been before, and they feel a sense of awe when looking at it. Traveling to the city of Camelin is like Pippin seeing the city of Minas Tirith for the first time in Return of the King. Or is like Tyrion Lannister in Game of Thrones visiting the Wall for the first time. There's a sense of awe and discovery that we share with these characters going to places that we have never been to before. However, here's the thing. The Wheel of Time series is long. It is at least 14 books, not counting the prequel novel, and these are long, lengthy books, 700 to 800 pages on average. They are pretty lengthy. So over the course of the story and all the different POV characters, which there's a lot, probably even more than Game of Thrones has, they have to introduce lots of new plot elements to keep things interesting, and also add in a way for the characters to travel to and fro so that the author doesn't get into a similar type of Marinese knot style of situation. As the Wheel of Time series goes on, it begins to have a lot of similarities with the Song of Ice and Fire. Similar to Game of Thrones, the Wheel of Time books have political intrigue and complex character work, but there is a big difference. The Wheel of Time places a much higher emphasis on magic. Eventually, characters learn that they can utilize magic and make gateways that teleport themselves and armies across the world. Other characters can jump into a dream dimension and exit someplace else. And even in the first book, The Eye of the World, there's a mystical pathway that makes travel faster, but is dangerous, so it's pretty risky to use. The fast travel in Wheel of Time is necessary because these are lengthy books with hundreds of POV characters, and the ability to travel is absolutely necessary to make sure the plot moves to where it needs to go, often at rapid-fire pace. This ensured that Robert Jordan would never have to be in a type of Mirror Knees Not style problem that George R.R. Martin was, because there's enough characters that know how to escape that style of situation, because there's an in-narrative justification as to why many characters can escape from the certain corners that they would have been otherwise written into. Additionally, the Wheel of Time features multiple in-depth, hard, and soft magic systems that really do describe the fantastical elements in narrative and make them believable. On another note, let me be clear, the Wheel of Time is not faultless when it comes to the traversal and the amount of characters. Like, the series is very long and known for the fact that it kind of has a slog towards the middle half of it, and a lot of that's due to all the POV characters. But it is worth noting that the writers, whether it was Robert Jordan or Brandon Sanderson, were able to get around this with the characters' elements of traversal in order to advance the plot and produce more books at a regular rate compared to, say, Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. So yes, the Wheel of Time did have some elements that were similar to A Song of Ice and Fire, with the numerous POV characters and the just amount of plot going on. But the authors of the Wheel of Time were able to maneuver around it in an easier manner than, say, Martin is, which is why the Wheel of Time is done and A Song of Ice and Fire isn't. Game of Thrones as a television show has a lot of problems, but some of those problems about the fast travel shouldn't just be blamed on the showrunners themselves. When comparing A Song of Ice and Fire to other fantasy series, it's clear that George R.R. Martin wrote his numerous characters into several narrative corners due to both the book's dark, realistic tone and soft magic system that doesn't really explain itself and doesn't allow for a nuanced way of fast travel that could have let those sad cornered characters get to where they needed to be in the story without going on a plotting journey. And with that, it's no wonder that A Song of Ice and Fire, the books, are probably not going to be finished anytime soon, which is unfortunate. They are good books, and George R.R. Martin, very talented writer. But, you know, he kind of wrote himself into a corner here. And hopefully someday we'll see how he untangles the knot. See ya. I'd like to thank a few of my patrons, especially my first patron, the Slasher of Veils. It means a lot to me that you put your faith and trust in me, and we've been friends for a long time. So it just means a lot to me that you're helping me out now. As I've said, we've been friends for a long time. I would also like to thank my mom, for she has been my mom for a long time, and also one of my other big patrons. And I'd just like to say, hey Mom, I love you, and thank you.